How are you guys? Don't forget to leave a review and enjoy the story. Enjoy watching. The story begins. A carriage was rushing through the dense night. Suddenly, a lone arrow flashed through the air and slammed into the wall with incredible force. It was only one arrow. The carriage continued on its way, but the people in it panicked, terrified of the possible attack. There was a creaking and scraping sound outside. The people in the carriage stared at the door in surprise and wondered if the carriage had stopped. The man sat and grinned indignantly. Then he got out of the carriage menacingly, told the coachman what he was doing, and ordered him to drive on. Footsteps sounded in the street. A man in uniform and boots replied that this would never happen because the horse was gone. The man looked around shocked. The dark-haired guy in uniform was covered in blood running down his cheeks and clothes. He smiled and said a cheeky hello, calling the man from the carriage an old man. There was only darkness in front of his eyes, but light was slowly starting to break through his eyelids. A dark-haired guy in uniform and boots lay on the grass and squinted, slowly coming to his senses. Someone shouted enthusiastically to him that he was alive. The guy finally opened his eyes and was puzzled as to why he was addressed by the name Pat. He continued to stare confusedly at the sky and pondered the fact that his name was Gene. So why Pat and not Gene? The guy's head was splitting and fellow recruits were yelling around him. Then he raised his body, still sitting on the ground, and answered Wayne, the guy with his back to him, that he was alive. The man turned his head in his direction and urged him to draw his sword and help him. Pat reached out for the sword. Directly in front of him was a battle between Wayne and the other soldiers and a mob of huge orcs. The entire battlefield was strewn with blood. The giants were mercilessly crushing the soldiers' heads, slicing them in half, and the bodies of the orcs lay on the ground, covered with the fighters' arrows. Pat frowned, glinted his sword, and sighed at how hard they were to deal with. In the next second, he was off the ground, swung his sword straight up in a leap, and was at the back of one of the orcs' head. Wishing him dead, Pat sliced the enemy's head open with his sword, continued the blow on inertia, and left a bloody trail. He then stood in the middle of the battlefield with his scarlet sword, scratched the back of his head, and asked for the next opponent. One of the soldiers shouted that they needed to heal all the survivors. But a terrifying creature, the Orc King, appeared on the horizon. The archers got into an attack posture and gave the command to fire. The orc only glanced disdainfully in the direction of the arrows, which did not even slightly graze his rough skin. Only small scratches were left on his body. The orc took his hammer and smashed the head of one of the soldiers while the others were powerless. Pat stepped forward and confidently signaled that the invasion must be stopped at all costs, while he himself pondered the fact that the sword was too fragile. The orc towered over the fighters like a living mountain of muscle and fury, his axe whistling through the air, leaving behind the bodies of the fallen. Pat felt the weight of his axe in his hands, turned it over, and lunged forward at the monster. He lunged for the monster's leg, swung the axe sharply, and sliced through the Achilles tendon. Blood spurted in a fountain, showering his face with warm, sticky moisture. The orc roared, his body shuddering in pain, but his rage only intensified. A powerful paw gripped the axe, and the next moment the wooden handle was flying at the boy. Pat jumped as the weapon passed right beside him, and looked anxiously at the wooden handle of the axe. But the blow came at him anyway, the hilt smashing into his rib, and the pain, sharp and searing, pierced his entire body. The orc jerked to the side, and Pat went flying across the dusty ground. Blood blurred his eyes, and his ears rang. But through the noise he heard shouts that the orc had slowed. The fighters continued the battle with the orc, wounding him, going on the attack, while the enemy squirmed in pain and took a hand to his shot eyes. Pat could no longer rise. His eyelids were leaden. His body refused to obey. All around was pitch blackness. Pat woke up lying in bed in a room with wooden floors and walls. A medical bandage was on his head, and his thoughts were filled with the question of what this place was. Wayne stood by the bed. He turned to Pat and replied that this was the camp where the wounded were treated, and it was good to see him awake. Wayne then asked how Pat's wound was, to which he said about severe pain in his stomach area. Wayne smiled and said that Pat was just lucky to have survived being hit by the Orc King, even though it was only an axe, to which he asked what was up with the Orc King. Wayne told how on the bloody battlefield after all that had happened, he stuck a spear in the orc's eye, and when the opponent was stunned, the fighters beat him to death. Pat was impressed and praised his comrades' merit greatly. Wayne replied that if it wasn't for MC, the spear would not have caught up with his opponent. Pat was very upset that he was hit, causing him to pass out. Wayne replied that he was extremely surprised that a friend was able to get behind the orc's back. Pat smiled and told Wayne standing by the bed that it was all due to the faint effect of being there. Wayne agreed that it had always been hard to figure out his location. Pat laughed, but immediately grimaced in pain. Wayne turned around and asked Pat to sleep a little longer while he went to the captain and told him the MC was awake. Pat escorted him out with a look. The hospital was very crowded with patients lying in their beds. There were doctors walking around them. Since the Orc army had been discovered, the 3rd Battalion of the kingdom's 1st Army was ordered to attack them. The king of the army and his minions were either killed or wounded, and the citizens were unharmed. Pat closed his eyes with fatigue. After all, he is an ex-Japanese. Wayne didn't even realize that the MC had only cut the Orc's tendon on his ankle. Pat, the dark-haired guy in uniform and boots. Real name Patrick Rigsby. 3rd son of a baronial family on the western border of the kingdom. 15-year-olds are considered adults in this world, and he had joined the army in the Royal Army. Patrick reflected on the fact that he didn't even remember why he joined the army. He thought about the memories of Japan and realized that he needed to go to bed. There was an appeal in the room. Wayne stood across from the captain and reported that Patrick Rigsby was awake. The captain thanked and gave the go-ahead to return. Wayne left the room, and the commander remained seated at his desk with his paperwork. An aide stood next to him. The commander said that the 3rd son of House Rigsby was doing better than expected and wondered how on earth he had managed to outsmart the Orc King. The aide asked what about a reward for Patrick. The commander replied that Pat would get 3 gold and a promotion as sergeant, 2 gold for Wayne and 10 silver to everyone else. The aide understood the order. Pat sat on the floor and shook out the contents of the sack, pondering what was inside the bags they had received at the award ceremony. Someone called out to him from the other room. Pat looked shocked at his hand that held 3 gold coins. Pat began to do his victory dance, bringing his hands above his head and smiling. Wayne entered the room and asked what this strange dance was all about. Pat looked around, said hello, and asked what about his reward. Wayne replied that he got 2 gold coins. Pat apologized and asked what he got 3 for. 1 copper 1 equals 100 yen. 1 silver equals 100,000 yen. 1 gold 1 equals 1 million yen. Pat marveled with pleasure at the fact that he was holding 3 million yen. Wayne had a grin on his face and asked his comrade what he was going to do with it. They silently looked at each other and understood without words. They decided to go to the gun store. There was a lone dagger lying on a table in the store. Pat stood against the wall of weapons, running his hand over the spears and marveling at how expensive they were. Wayne stood in the middle of the store and waved the spear around to test it in operation. He said it was because of the price that newcomers were given used spears. He then remembered seeing Patrick's spear break with 1 swing. MC stood in front of his friend and examined the hilt of one of the spears. He thought about how that was why he had to use the 2-handed sword he had been provided. Wayne said with a chuckle that Patrick had been hit with a club. Pat continued to examine the spear. In their world, it is possible to fight monsters from a distance. Spears are often used as primary weapons, but the price of a normal spear starts at 50 silver coins. But weapons of mass destruction are much more important than money. Sure, there are some people who care more about the sharpness and durability of the weapon, and some people focus on balance and weight. There's also the type of person who only cares about the appearance of the weapon. Pat looked at the wall of weapons while Wayne looked at the spear he had chosen. Patrick asked his comrade what about it. Wayne replied that he would prefer a sturdy one, but with a medium weight. The salesman standing nearby pulled out one of the spears and said that in that case an iron spear would be fine for him. Patrick and Wayne looked at the weapon in surprise. Pat said it looked pretty heavy. Wayne touched the spear with both hands. The salesman replied that it was hollow inside, so it wasn't that heavy. Wayne took the spear and began to swing it around with interest. Then he asked what the price of the weapon was. Then they began to haggle. The seller shouted that he demanded 2 gold coins. Wayne said that was expensive and offered 1 gold coin and 50 silver coins. The seller was against it, for the spear was made by a good craftsman and of iron, and asked what about 1 gold and 75 silver. Wayne replied that there was something there and offered 1 gold coin and 65 silver. The salesman exclaimed that 1 gold and 70 silver was the last price. Wayne agreed and said that was just fine. The guys were stunned at the yen 1700 price. The salesman turned to Pat and asked what he wanted. Pat hesitated and replied that he preferred light and spicy. The salesman interrupted and laid out 2 spears and said that was what they needed. The first spear has a slightly shorter handle, so it's lighter and easier to use. The blade would be flawless as well. The second one is of normal length with a slightly smaller tip. It's easier to hold, but the cutting ability is excellent. Patrick hesitated and put a finger to his temple. He pondered whether he could hit the back of his head with a longer reach. Pat stood at the counter across from the salesman and asked how expensive it was with the shortened tip. The salesman replied that it was a special offer this time, and they could give it away for 1 gold piece. Wayne was outraged and exclaimed that it wasn't fair. Patrick agreed and was thanked for his purchase. It was a soldier's early morning. The sky was calm and cloudless. There is no electricity in their world. Lamps and candles are very expensive. And firewood too. That's why the common man always wakes up early. Then the morning jog. The fighters ran through the field past the bushes. Breakfast. On the table were black hard bread, bean soup, and fried bacon. Then the soldiers of the royal army set about their duties, patrolling the capital to keep the royal capital safe, guarding the capital gates, and also patrolling all the streets of the capital. There are all sorts of so-called monsters around the royal capital. Adventurers also exist in their world. Some of them get orders from private individuals, where they need to hunt demons or collect medicinal herbs. Patrick doesn't get involved in matters that don't concern him. It's about the complete extermination of goblins, for example. A group of fighters were walking through the forest past the trees. One of them said he thought the goblins were not here. Another replied that he had seen 3 yesterday. A third doubted it was today. Wayne turned to the soldiers and ordered them not to let their guard down, for the enemy might be waiting. The soldiers perked up and listened to the order. Patrick reflected on the fact that goblins thrive in packs. Pat, the captain, was asked what he thought about it. Patrick approached Wayne and said that it hadn't been much since yesterday, but he had a feeling that the enemy was around here somewhere. Wayne confirmed this. MC was promoted to sergeant and put in charge of a platoon that consists of 3 men per squad. 3 squads, 1 to a platoon on the first mission. The master sergeant is at the head, aka the senior sergeant, the sergeant, aka deputy senior, second in the chain. Then comes the private and first squad private. Pat moved forward and suggested we go a little deeper into the woods. The soldiers followed him, the stomping and clacking of heels accompanying them on their way. Pat looked anxiously into the distance. Something ahead was making a strange chugging noise. He ordered a halt and, peering into the foliage, blocked the soldier's path with his hand. Pat turned back to the squad and began already handing out instructions. Sergeant Wayne's squad should go to the right. Captain Tony's squad would take the left side. Corporal Mirko's squad Patrick suggested that they go together in the middle and asked if the soldiers understood the order. The squad put a hand to their chest, signaling that they had accepted the instructions. Pat ordered Wayne and Tony to set the time. The attack would begin 5 minutes after the clock ran. In their world, there are 360 days in a year, 12 months of 30 days, 24 hours in a day. 1 hour is 60 minutes. There's also a useful item called a magic clock. Up above, the sky flickered between the trees. The squads moved forward. The soldiers split into 3 fronts. One of the groups was accompanied by Pat, periodically pushing them forward. Suddenly, they saw a pack of goblins in front of them. The green creatures were sitting near their prey, eating dead meat. They were sitting on the grass, slurping very loudly and dainting themselves on the fallow animal. Pat ordered the students to get ready. They raised their weapons, drew the bowstring, and aimed an arrow straight at the goblin, who sat happily devouring the animal's intestines. The archers began firing at the goblins sitting on the lawn. The arrows sank into their bodies. The goblins began to scream in pain. 3 screaming goblins lay on the grass, bleeding next to the carcass of the animal. 2 more stood nearby and looked around in surprise. Pat raised his hand and gave the order to start a second volley. He ordered the archers to fire as soon as they were ready. The fighters drew the bowstring. Both goblins were hit by arrows. Pat ordered the soldiers to be vigilant and get it over with. The soldiers drew their weapons and rushed into battle. They strung the bodies and heads of the goblins on their spears, then pushed the carcasses to the ground and finished them off. Wayne ordered the heads of the enemies to be cut off, as otherwise they would turn into zombies. Only the nose was to be left for proof to the elders. Wayne, with his rifle in his hand, was silently looking at the battlefield. Suddenly, something alarmed him, and the guy looked fearfully into the distance. At the same second, he turned around and prepared for battle and terror. Behind the trees stood a huge creature 2 trunks high. Wayne, preparing for a fight, exclaimed that it was a troll and marveled at what it was doing here. Pat, who had also prepared his weapons, ordered everyone to take their fighting positions, grab bow and start. The other commander instructed them to keep firing. The archers drew the bowstring and lowered their arrows. The troll loomed menacingly over the soldiers. Pat said not to stop and to ready their spears. The troll roared and went with an attack on the soldiers, who pointed their spears in his direction. The first thing he did was bring his club over Wayne's head. He managed to dodge it. Wayne slid across the battlefield and managed to wound the troll. Then he realized to his horror that it wasn't enough. The troll realized something was wrong, pulled away from the soldiers, and looked back at his back. At that moment, Wayne was climbing along the spine of the monster. That's when he drew his sword from its sheath, jumped up, and struck with fury. Blood rushed down the troll's body, and it roared menacingly. Wayne pulled his sword from his back and recoiled. Standing next to the giant, he thought about delivering another blow to the wound. Suddenly, someone shouted to him to get down. and Wayne immediately followed the instruction. Pat jumped out from behind his comrade and pierced the monster with his spear. The troll, writhing in pain, bent, bleeding, and let out a roar. The roar grew louder with each passing second. Pat and Wayne looked tensely at the monster and realized they had to attack now. They pushed themselves off the ground to strike. Wayne gave a monster a long longitudinal wound with his sword, from which blood immediately gushed out and flooded both soldiers. The troll fell, dropping its huge head straight to the ground. Wayne turned to the captain with a question as he wiped his blood-stained face with his cuff. Pat looked off into the distance with a calm smile despite being covered in the blood of his enemy. MC stood in the middle of the forest and looked at the defeated troll. Looking at its body, he pondered for a moment. Then he gave out commands to the soldiers standing nearby. Tony he asked to cut off the troll's head, and he obeyed the order. Patrick asked if there were any wounded, to which he received the answer that there were no serious wounds, not even scratches. Then it was necessary to carry the troll's head and report it. In the colonel's room, the soldiers were saying that this was the end of the report. One of them said he would be there after work and would do some research. Pat began to listen warily to the conversation. Word came from a room that perhaps some were still in hiding. They have a mobile unit, but it's up to the captain to decide who to send. The colonel asked what about Lieutenant Junior Lieutenant Paginel. Pat was extremely tired, and upon reaching his room, he exhaled. Through his sleep, he heard shouts of people in the corridor urgently looking for stretchers and bandages and asking the wounded man to come to his senses and stay awake. Pat immediately woke up and became alarmed. As he left the room, he saw the men asking for a towel and hot water and examining the soldier. Pat tugged one of the men by the sleeve and asked what was wrong, and the man was at a loss as to who was in front of him. It became known that a squad had gone into the forest to investigate the trolls, but they had run into them and were badly injured as a result. In a stretcher lay a man bleeding under a white sheet. 15 men were wounded, 3 of them in serious condition. The soldiers had just returned from battle. Pat watched as the doctors carried the wounded man away. He was shocked that the squad had immediately gone on a reconnaissance mission after that incident, also at night. His look expressed utter bewilderment. In horror, he thought about the fact that no matter how slow a troll was, it would be suicide to fight it at night, because humans can't move normally at night. That's why a night battle is the best choice for them. Do the soldiers not remember what they learned at the military academy? Or is it because of something else? Colonel Rader was trying to figure out who the junior Lieutenant Scott Pagineau was who was in charge of this troll investigation. The aide replied that he had the man's personnel file. The colonel was horrified, thinking about the fact that they had only recently ordered the squad to investigate and they had already gone into the forest and killed 2 trolls, and wondering what those who went into the forest at a time like this were thinking, since it was tantamount to suicide. Along the corridor walked a man in a white uniform and with a braided braid. The people around him were outraged that it was Scott Pagineau, who hadn't been summoned anywhere. Scott walked with a confident stride and was proud that he had gone on investigation, killed 2 trolls, and came back alive. Maybe he would even be promoted to lieutenant. He walked into the colonel's office and politely apologized. In response, Scott was immediately asked what he thought of the damage done on his own operation. He was embarrassed by this and replied that he had been the first to spot the trolls, so he thought the damage was minimal. The colonel continued in a calm tone, explaining how 3 of the 15 soldiers had been seriously wounded during the investigation operation because Scott had left his post without permission at night to conduct reconnaissance, and asked if he thought the damage was still minimal. Scott vehemently resented these words. The next day, Sergeant Patrick was promoted to junior lieutenant and awarded 5 gold coins. Sergeant Wayne was promoted to staff sergeant and awarded 2 gold coins. Sergeant Scott was demoted and later resigned. It had been about a month since the killing of the trolls. Pat was sitting under a tree in the middle of the forest, admiring the pleasant breeze. Suddenly, Wayne appeared beside him and told him that the captain had ordered him to report. Just then another man approached them and politely apologized. Pat and Wayne turned to him in surprise, and the man reported that the battalion captain was asking Patrick to report immediately. The captain knows he is not easy to find, so he sent 2 men at once. Patrick was surprised and replied that he wasn't even hiding. At the meeting, Patrick stood in front of a crowd of soldiers and talked about the fact that this time the captain had ordered them to clear the way. The soldiers listened carefully that the crown prince would arrive at their place in 10 days. By then, they need to destroy the bandits and monsters. The commander of each squad was required to attend the strategy meeting. Wayne walked over to the table with the map, with Patrick standing behind it. Pat asked Wayne what he thought about it. The comrade replied that the main problem was the bandits, and the monsters could be eliminated as needed. Pat asked if the military investigates cases of aristocratic carriage attacks. He was told that there was information that a solitary troop was passing near the forest and the bandits did not attack them out of fear. Pat marveled that such incompetent people existed. The group of people standing around Pat stood silently looking at each other, trying to come up with a plan. Suddenly, the MC exclaimed that tomorrow they would have a preparatory day for this operation, so they could disperse, get ready tomorrow, and start the mission early the day after tomorrow. A day later, the horse-drawn carriages were rushing down the road. From the bushes came the words that it seemed to be a good catch, and the cargo looked expensive, so everything would go easily. There were 3 men standing in the bushes. One of them asked what the plan was, to which the other replied, "Just do your job and rob the carriage." The bandits started firing at the carriage and the attack. One of the bandits shot the soldier with a sword. The others ran up and engaged in combat with swords and axes. The soldiers fended off the blows. One of the bandits encouraged his comrades and said that this was a real battle. More bandits jumped out of the bushes and the battlefield turned into a bloody massacre. Suddenly, people started coming out of one of the carriages. One of the bandits looked back in surprise. The soldiers made the decision to disguise themselves as a caravan and wait for the bandits to attack, place some guards outside so there wouldn't be too many of them, and when the bandits attacked, they would destroy them. Until then, they would just rest and wait for the moment. The soldiers jumped out of the carriage and started a furious battle. The bandits shouted that there were soldiers in the carriage, and if this continued, they would crush them in numbers. The bandits called out to their captain. The captain turned around and saw that his subordinates were dead. He was amazed at how fast it had happened. Suddenly, Pat appeared at his shoulder. With a beatific smile, he instantly cut off the bandit's head. It had been beveled by the sword, almost torn off, and held on only by a small piece of flesh. The body of the enemy fell to the ground. The bandits turned on their captain in fear. Seeing that he was dead, they ran away screaming. The ground was soaked with blood, and clouds floated across the sky. That was all. Pat reported that 51 bandits had been killed, 1 taken prisoner. Of his personnel, 2 soldiers had been killed, as well as 3 wounded. Pat asked worriedly who had been killed. The responder standing next to him said that Ed and Private Carter were killed. Pat then asked who the 3 wounded men were. He was told that 1 soldier had a cut hand, but his life was not life-threatening, and he was already being treated. Pat gave the order to join Kane's squad and take all the dead and 3 wounded to the royal capital by carriage. The others should interrogate the captives. Meanwhile, the others should investigate the bandits' base, in case there were any captured inhabitants. Pat fell gloomily silent. Wayne came up behind him and told him not to get depressed. After all, with only 2 dead in a fight like this, it wasn't all bad. Pat replied that he knew, but in the end he thought he could have done better, and was sorry that these families had lost loved ones. Patrick left, steeped in sadness, and Wayne headed off toward the men who were looking at the slain bandits and checking to see if there were any pretenders. One of the bandits, who had overheard their conversation, sped off into the woods. Suddenly, one of the soldiers called out to Pat, who turned around and asked what he wanted to talk about. The soldier replied that the prisoner had not uttered a word. Pat grinned with excitement and took an interest in this. Wayne approached one of the soldiers and asked if the bandits' hideout was destroyed. The man replied that they were verifying the information with the squad leader. The bandit shouted from the room that he wouldn't say anything, which was followed by a reply that he could keep quiet because he was on the verge of death anyway, and a request to wake up. The yelling coming from the room made the soldier and Wayne cringe. The bandit screamed that he would say anything and begged for it to stop. Pat asked for some rest and asked if the prisoner wanted a second round. The bandit continued to yell that he would say anything, begging to stop. Pat replied that he hadn't played around yet. Then the MC, with a completely calm face, walked out of the room. Turning to the soldiers, he said that the bandit had cracked and gave away the location of the hideout. Silence followed, and the soldiers headed towards the room. Opening the door, they were shocked at the way the commander had cracked it open. Daylight spilled into the room. There on a chair sat the bandit. His elbows and knees had open fractures. His entire body was shredded. His nose and ears were cut off. His teeth were knocked out. The nails on his hands and feet were ripped out, and the waste products were dripping under the chair. All his clothes were soaked with blood. One of the soldiers experienced a gagging fit, but another ordered him not to. They were at a loss as to how to clean it all up. There were teeth lying on the floor, covered in blood. Wayne called out to Pat and asked if he had overdone it and scared the soldiers. Pat turned around. He was troubled as to whether it was really that bad. The thought was floating around in his head that it didn't compare to what he had done before. Wayne asked if he felt nothing after the murder, since he looked so calm. MC replied that he only finished off the bandits who came with the intention of killing them, and he only kills bandits and cockroaches, as they're just like cockroaches. Clouds floated across the sky. The comrades advanced through the forest, then they looked between the trees and realized that this cave was the hideout. Pat turned around and started giving orders. Looking at the cave, he ordered his squad and Wayne's platoon to go inside and the others to check for survivors in the area. The soldiers looked around, then readied their spears. Pat's squad began to enter the shelter with candles in hand. He recognized that the bandit was right and the food warehouse had been looted. All around him were only empty crates and an armful of hay. Then he turned around and blessed the room, which turned out to be the armory. He was surprised to find that there was someone in front of the trophy room. He illuminated the edge of the grate and saw someone's feet. Behind the grate were a wolf in human clothing and armor, an elderly man, and a blonde-haired child. The child clung fearfully to the man. Just as the captive had said, there were 3 of them. Pat introduced himself and said that he was a lieutenant of the 1st Royal Army, and the bandit they caught confessed that he had taken 3 kingdom residents captive, so they had come to rescue the captives. He assumed that these men were relatives of the dead and wanted to know the names. The man exclaimed admiringly that this was the Royal Army. He thanked the soldier profusely and said that at first he thought they were adventurers. He introduced himself and said his name was Carlos, pointed to the wolf, with the words that it was their watchdog mark. And the boy is the 3rd son of the Marquis family, Kevin Dixon. The boy looked very kind and innocent, with a cape over his shoulders. Pat was extremely surprised at the Dixon surname and that he had met the Marquis family. The commander began to draw his scabbard sword and said that they were about to release the prisoners, so he asked them to move farther away. The very next second, he chopped the bars. The bars fell to the ground. Carlos thanked the soldiers for saving them and said he would definitely reward them. Pat, standing in front of them with a candle, asked them not to do that, as it was their duty. Carlos replied that he would report everything to his master anyway. The boys snuggled into the hem of the man's clothing. Patrick waved his hand and said they really shouldn't since they were here on duty. Carlos asked the soldier about the fact that he had mentioned his last name of Rigsby earlier. The captain huffed, agreed, and remembered that his family had a bad reputation. Then he exclaimed that he was ashamed to admit it, but he was the 3rd son of the Rigsby family. He had been kicked out of the house, so he didn't care about them now. Here he remembered that he should not talk about it here. Then the man expressed his sincere gratitude to the captain, but he didn't accept it and said it was just a service. Looking at this dialogue, Kevin said that it must be that if Mr. Patrick accepted a thank you from the Marquis family, it would tarnish his honor. He then added that surely they would reward the soldiers as well, and asked Patrick if he was the squad leader. Pat was much surprised that the boy, though small, was bright. He answered that he was acting company commander for the time being, to which he replied that it was an honor to be a company commander at such a young age. Kevin smiled and said that they could not leave Mr. Patrick without a proper reward. He confidently acknowledged the fact that although the soldiers were on duty, they had saved them. Patrick agreed, but noted that they didn't need a big reward and asked not to worry. Then he suggested that they return to the highway to have a carriage take the Marquis of Dixon home. Soon the carriage was already rushing along the road, and only the clatter of hooves echoed in the silence. Then the son of the Marquis remembered that it was the Royal Army and looked back. He realized that it would easily deal with the attacking monsters. The coachman replied that their company commander and platoon leader were strong. There were bloody bodies lying on the ground. The coachman went on to say that at the front, the monsters are destroyed by the platoon commander, but at the rear, the company commander slaughters them. Suddenly, the carriage stopped, and someone called out to the liaison. A huge army was seen on the highway. Horses and a crowd could be seen in the distance. Patrick asked in regard to numbers if these people were bandits, to which he received a negative answer. The reporter said that some banners could be seen, to which the commander ordered that everyone be put on alert. He then ordered his own banners to be raised as well. The soldiers raised their flags, and it became clear that it had been 2 days since the kidnapping. A rider dressed in a cloak and holding the reins of a horse approached the army. He said that they came from the Marquis Dixon's army, Rycall's detachment, and Letterman's cavalry, and asked if they were part of the king's army. He then added that he wished to speak to the leader of their troop. Pat looked up and stood in front of the man who had jumped from his horse to the ground. He introduced himself and said that he was the commander of this company, to which the arriving man asked what the occasion was that their troops were here for. Patrick replied that they had a mission to find the bandits' hideout. They had secured the safety of His Excellency Marquis Dixon's son and were just about to escort him to the estate, but he would like to get information from the commander. The arriving man marveled at this news. Thus it was decided to unite with Marquis Dixon's army on the way to his estate, and it was not even bad that they would arrive there. The carriages pulled up to the big town, and the men, marching ahead of the horses, waved flags. Pat turned to the commander of a detachment of the Marquis army and said that here they should say goodbye. The latter was very surprised, for the Marquis mansion was very near, and if the commander had not come to the shelter, it might not have been possible to save Mr. Kevin. He bowed respectfully and expressed his sincere thanks, adding that he would very much like the captain to meet his master. Patrick was embarrassed by these words and had to accept the offer. Thus went the royal army into the possession of the Marquis. In his thoughts, Patrick was grateful for such kind words and was surprised that the soldiers would be given a break from their military service. As soon as the men entered the property, Kevin rushed to his father. The people around him were puzzled. The Marquis leaned over and held out his hands to his son. The boy then pointed to Patrick standing in the doorway. The father was glowing with happiness, and Pat exhaled with relief. The feast began in the hall. There were tables covered with a variety of viands. People and waiters walked around. During the feast, the Marquis called Patrick, who felt awkward, and handed him a bag of money. The captain's hand fell from the weight of the coins. He thought about what a good man the Marquis was, because he not only fed him, but also gave him money and prepared sleeping places. At that second, the Marquis called the captain again. He turned around and saw a smile on his face. Pat readily agreed, thinking that such an offer was hard to refuse. The Marquis, expressing his gratitude, asked for permission to thank the captain again for saving not only Kevin, but Carlos and Mark as well. The expression on Pat's face betrayed his surprise and embarrassment at such a display of enthusiasm. He was shocked that such a thing was being said to him by the Marquis himself. Then he replied that the most important thing was that his son was fine, and he was the one who was grateful to him for such a welcome, even though they were only doing their duty. The Marquis smiled and said that it was the least he could do for saving his son, and Pat thought about the fact that he was a simple soldier and did not need to be so scattered in gratitude to him. The Marquis huffed and said it was for saving their son and keeping them from the disgrace that would have reached them if the robbers had taken the money away. The soldiers deserved far more gratitude than he could express. That was why the Marquis asked what the captain wished, for perhaps there was something he could do for him. Pat was extremely embarrassed and confused, and wondered why the Marquis was acting this way. The Marquis continued to question him vigorously about what he could do, even minor things. Pat refused each time, but the Marquis insisted on his own and said that if suddenly the captain got into trouble, he would definitely bail him out and could count on him. Pat exhaled a sigh of relief. Pat smiled, thanked the Marquis, and said he was leaving for the bedroom while he thought about how he could barely keep from yawning. The next second, he threw himself on the bed. It was already light outside the window. Wayne and Pat went into the Marquis's room to notify him that they were returning to the capital. The Marquis asked them to take care of themselves. The soldiers arrived at the capital of the kingdom. Standing in the colonel's room, Pat said that the mission to eliminate bandits and demons had been successfully completed and the report was over. He felt it was right to keep silent about the Marquis reward. In response, the colonel praised the captain and asked him to take a couple days off to let the soldiers rest. Pat thanked him for his concern and asked him to bow out. After a while, the colonel asked the aide if Rigsby's army was really that excellent, to which he received the reply that it must have been because it was made up of soldiers from Rigsby's platoon, especially Lance Sergeant Rigsby and Sergeant Kimball. The colonel then asked if the visit to the Marquis had gone smoothly. The aide confirmed that it had, but said that if His Highness had said he wanted to go in a small party, no cleaning would have been required. The colonel replied that it was because His Highness hates traveling with large numbers of people out of his love of traveling incognito. A few days later, His Majesty's reconnaissance mission to the Marquis was successfully completed. The engagement of the Marquis's eldest daughter was also arranged. Petals and flowers were thrown into the air. Light as a whisper, they twirled in a slow dance, mixed in fanciful patterns, filling the space with a delicate fragrance. It seemed as if the sky itself had decided to make this quiet celebration. Pat looked at it and noticed that the town had such a festive atmosphere. Just then Wayne came up to him and Patrick asked him what was wrong. Wayne looked down wistfully and replied that the Empire's actions were suspicious. Pat was extremely surprised at such a statement. This news dispelled such a beautiful atmosphere. Pat wondered about the actions of the Empire. The Empire, more precisely the Saban Empire, the great empire to the west of their kingdom. They were supporters of racial superiority. They also had constant disputes with neighboring countries over mines. The soldiers were quietly talking at the table about how it was still unknown if they were going to attack and take over the mines, or if they planned to defend the borders with the help of the Western Army and Marquis Weston's army. One of the soldiers said that the Western Army was strong, but the Marquis Weston's army was severely weakened due to money problems. Pat was sitting nearby and overheard the dialogue. He turned around with the thought that he had a bad feeling. A few days later, the soldiers were actively discussing the events going on in the world, that the Empire had made its move and something had begun. This news quickly spread throughout the army. In a spacious hall, there was a meeting. In the center stood a long table, at which on each side sat people in uniform. Someone turned to His Majesty and said that right now, the Western Army was fighting a battle on the border and the situation was constantly changing. The man sitting at the head of the table was furious and exclaimed what Weston was doing. Another man said that according to the report, it would take them some time to join forces, to which he received the reply that it was more like they were short of men. There were rumblings in the room that there were rumors that the Marquis had squandered all the funds. Another man replied that it was not a rumor, but a fact. Roger then ordered to first tell the Western Army to hold on and send 1,000 soldiers to the Southern Army to the borders of the Sabine Empire. White clouds slowly floated over the state. A few days later, it became known that Weston had betrayed them. Entering the colonel's room, the soldier reported that when the Western Army was fighting the Empire Army, the Marquis attacked them from the back. The Western Army suffered serious losses. The fortress was captured by the enemies, and the survivors joined the Southern Army. This man was crushed by everything that was happening, and tears were streaming down his cheeks as he talked about the brigadier general being killed, and he had returned as a colonel of the Southern Army to report the situation. His Majesty lowered his head, realizing that even someone like Lanigan couldn't stand it. The man sitting next to him said that Weston's aides were conspiring with the Empire. Then Roger ordered the Royal Army to be sent. For the army of the Empire, Weston's traitors must be defeated. Pat stood in his study, a paper in front of him saying that he had been conscripted. Then he took the document in his hand and was surprised to see their information about the army of the Marquis of Weston. The colonel replied that they had betrayed the kingdom. Pat then resented being summoned and bitterly told him that his family owned territory in the West. Not to mention that they were quite close to the Marquis, and whatever it was must have something to do with his father. As he continued reading, he said that he needed to think hard, because a showdown with Weston would lead to him having to go up against his own father. Personally, he would never betray the kingdom, but others may say otherwise. A little while later, Patrick entered the meeting room where there were people around a long table. Patrick introduced himself then. He raised his hand to his chest to show an act of respect. In front of him were 11 men in formal uniforms who sat on either side of the table and looked at him. One of them turned to the junior lieutenant and asked him to forgive them for summoning him now. It was General Andretti, the head of their army. Patrick apologized and asked what they wanted to know. When the general asked if the relationship between Rigby and Weston was so strong that they had each other's backs, even when one side was accused of treason, Patrick looked at the general and asked first to explain his family situation. His mother had passed away, and his father and his brother's wife were quite greedy. Like Weston, they were short on land taxes. Pat continued the conversation by saying that this was why they had asked Weston to help with the money, and the debt would not be small, but if Weston offered to lower the interest or reduce the amount owed, they could betray the nation. Besides, in the Empire, taxes are collected by the lords, and if the Empire had promised Weston a place in the aristocrats for winning, it was no wonder they wanted to betray them. The general hesitated and asked if there was any confirmation of this. Pat replied sullenly that he could never trust those who were capable of betraying a nation in exchange for some promises. The general raised his hand and asked interestedly why Patrick distrusted his own family so vehemently. Then Pat lowered his eyes. His words rang in the air as to whether he could take a moment to tell something about himself, but it would take some time. The general listened to the lieutenant's story and said that the Rigsbys had done what could be construed as treason and asked if Patrick had anything more to say. Pat then replied that he was sure there were other traitors. The general asked who exactly, to which the lieutenant replied that men such as Viscount Harder, Baron Curry, and Baron Ease had also borrowed money from Weston. When asked by the general where he had learned all this, if he had cut ties with his family, Patrick replied that he was still in touch with his mother's family and had learned everything from them. The general put both hands on the table, said that he generally understood what was going on and would instruct General Andretti to lead the army. Turning to the junior lieutenant, he said there was an assignment for him and wanted to confide in him. Pat replied that it was an honor and asked if he could find out what the assignment was. Running down the hallway, Patrick called out to Wayne, who turned around and asked what was wrong. Pat shouted that His Majesty the Marshal had given orders, and he had to go now, and asked his comrade to take care of the platoon. Wayne looked around in shock, and Patrick said he had no choice and he was assigning it to him. Wayne threw up his hands and started questioning his friend about the order, the Marshal, and what was going on. Did by Marshal he really mean His Majesty the King, and why the platoon was on him? At last, Pat blurted out that he couldn't go into details, but he understood in general, and also the lieutenant would take 2 guys from the platoon. Wayne watched Pat running away and silently wondered what was even going on. A crowd of men were walking along the street. Some had banners in their hands, others were riding in carts, and still others were just walking alongside. The pounding of feet resounded in the air. The head ordered the Royal Army to march forward. At the front of the army stood Wayne. The invasion of the West was going fairly smoothly. The soldiers stood in the middle of the road. As early as tomorrow, they would be in Weston's territory. Suddenly, an arrow split the air and hit the shoulder of one of the soldiers. The soldiers were shocked, and one of them shouted that it was a trap in a trap. His Highness stood in front of the army. He frowned menacingly and drew his sword from its sheath. He said that, as expected, Weston had betrayed them. The Empire had gone too far. They were truly a disgrace to the kingdom. But one must act as ordered. His Highness waved his hand and ordered the soldiers behind him to go out to attack. The soldiers fought the enemy with swords. The battlefield was filled with soldiers and drenched in blood. The soldiers were shocked that the fortresses that had been built in Weston's territory were being used against them. His Majesty ordered the wagons to be broken down faster, using the planks as shields, for they need to defend themselves from arrows. Wayne looked at him and carried out the order. The boards were broken and connected to the iron bars. Wayne looked in surprise at one of the constructed shields that were now in the soldiers' hands and wondered if it could be called a shield and if it would work. The soldiers closed the shields tightly, and in the same instant a hail of arrows rained down on their steel surfaces, like a downpour pounding on an iron roof. Wood and metal groaned under the blows, but the formation did not waver. They rushed through the chaos like a wave crashing against the rocks. Some caught the whistling arrows on the fly. Others covered themselves with shields, deflecting the deadly rain. Their blades flashed like lightning in a thunderstorm, clearing the way. The earth itself seemed to tremble under this unstoppable onslaught. Wayne exclaimed in surprise that it was working and ordered them to keep chipping away at the boards. The fighters went on to attack further. Wayne broke off a couple more boards with his sword, clearing a path. He continued to attack the enemy, covering himself with a board that had enemy arrows sticking out of it. Walking ahead of the soldiers, he turned to them and ordered them to kill the enemies before they released their arrows. The soldiers struck the enemy with their swords, shredding the army and clearing a way forward. Continuing onward, Wayne said that if this kept up, they could break into the fortress. Suddenly, Wayne turned around. The soldiers ducked, and cavalry arose behind them. A man on horseback, shrouded in steel, crashed through the ranks of soldiers like a battering ram, smashing through a breach in a wall. The loud clattering of hoofbeats and shouts blended with the shouting as his horse reared up, knocking the warriors over like reeds in a hurricane wind. Wayne stood still, clutching the hilt of his sword to his white knuckles. His heart was pounding, but his legs didn't waver. As the rider sprang at him, Wayne crouched and swung his blade, the blade glinting as it cut through the horse's sinews. The animal howled, tumbling forward, and the rider tumbled over its head, hitting the ground hard. Dust kicked upward. He instinctively pressed his elbows into the ground, trying to get up, but Wayne had already drawn his sword. The steel whistled through the air and downward. In the next second, he ordered the soldiers not to stand as pillars, to do whatever they could to keep a safe distance. Continuing to fight furiously, he said not to give up, for their cavalry was coming. We must hold on. And on the battlefield were a huge number of people, on foot and on horseback. The ground was soaked with blood. Everyone was shocked because more reinforcements were coming, and His Majesty was so battle-weary that drops of sweat were running down his forehead. The soldiers' morale was beginning to weaken. He stood up and tried to catch his breath as something ahead caught his eye. In the distance, a column of smoke rose above the mountain. His Majesty exclaimed and pointed out to the soldiers that the enemy's food store was on fire. Without supplies, they would have to starve for days. It looked like the kingdom had already won. Wayne looked back. There was blood running down his cheek. There was a 3-story building on the mountain with puffs of smoke coming from it. The food warehouse had been burnt. Wiping his face with his sleeve, Wayne wondered what was wrong. Above the towers, clouds flew in the sky. Soldiers were rushing through the corridors. A hand appeared from around the corner, and then a child, with 2 ponytails on its head, asking what was wrong. A little earlier, the soldiers were running through the woods. Words were heard, addressed to Lieutenant Patrick about whether or not this was their plan. On the run, the lieutenant replied that they should change into enemy uniforms so they would not be seen and set fire to the food depot. The soldier running beside him was discouraged that they would need to do this. The squad tried to say something, but were told that Patrick would infiltrate their ranks alone and the rest of them would only need to stand guard. The soldiers replied approvingly that if the lieutenant went alone, it was likely that no enemy would notice him. Then Patrick turned around and said he was going. As Pat stepped back, the soldiers began to interject that if the junior lieutenant was serious about infiltrating the enemy ranks undetected, it was likely that he really wouldn't be detected. Pat walked down the road to where the enemy's carriage stood, and men were carrying sacks from it. Looking up, he realized the warehouse was here. There was a structure in front of him. Patrick pronounced that they were using a tent to store supplies. Looking into it, he saw bags of food, and as he ran his fingers over the contents of one of them, he realized he had hit it right on the spot. He then tasted the contents and realized they were rather rare ingredients. Opening one of the bottles, he decided to take this oil. With one wave of his hand, Patrick poured it all over the tent, and in the next second, he set the oil on the bag on fire. Exiting the basement tent, he moved on. He went through each one in this manner. Finally, the soldiers noticed a strange odor. Terrified, they started rushing around screaming that all the food warehouses were on fire and they needed to carry water immediately. Pat walked calmly down the street while the soldiers ran around, trying to put out the fire. He silently walked out of the crowd unnoticed. Suddenly, one of the men turned his attention to him, thinking that he was the one who had killed their captains. The man immediately fled, for he had somehow gotten into the army. But Pat had ruined his life again, and this place could not be saved, for the god of death had come there. Pat went back to the troop and said he was back. The soldiers jumped up and turned around, much to his surprise. One of them told the junior lieutenant to walk louder as he approached his comrades. The sky above the warehouse was covered in smoke. The soldiers asked how it went, to which they received the reply that there was no problem. They had successfully burned down the enemy supply depots and sowed panic in their ranks. The next day, the revolutionaries began to retreat to the western fortress. Wayne wondered if they had lost all their provisions. Without provisions, the morale of the revolutionaries had plummeted. Thus, the royal army began to push back the revolutionaries. The battlefield looked like a bloody mess. The enemies were chopped to pieces. At the same time, the Rigsby family also showed up at the western fortress where the Weston, Harder, Carey, and Edge families were hiding. A carriage was rushing down the road. It sat a married couple. The man was yelling that they had to go quickly because the royal army was already approaching the Westing lands, and they would be crushed if they hesitated. The woman asked, perplexed, why they should hide in this fortress, for they had done nothing wrong. Would they not be released if they said so? Then the man said that it was too late to talk about it. After all, among the soldiers are those who bear their family crest. The woman asked if he was talking about their sons, to which she received the reply that they would come there with the soldiers and needed to take provisions and money. Pat realized that his father had come. Then he told the inspector to examine everything carefully, both his training and his readiness to act and to report to His Majesty. Patrick said he was going. Pat stood in the woods with Boo in his hands. He had drawn the bowstring and was ready to act. A carriage was passing near him. Suddenly there were shouts that the enemy was attacking. Someone had released an arrow. We must go faster. The carriage stopped. Pat had disarmed the coachman in one movement and was already putting his sword away in its scabbard. The carriage and his face were drenched in blood, but his gaze was indifferent. Behind his back came the voice of a man wondering what the coachman was doing and the words to hurry. Pat realized it was his father. The man stepped out of the carriage and motioned for it to start. The lieutenant replied that movement was impossible as they had no horse. He stepped out with a sinister smile on his face, a bloody sword in his hands. The man realized in a daze that it was Patrick. MC turned to his father and said they hadn't seen each other in a long time. The man furiously squealed that it was not customary to speak to his father like that and asked what he was doing here. Pat interrupted him and told him he was a junior lieutenant in the Royal Army. The man was furious at such words and began to ridicule Patrick for such a thing as he could not become a junior lieutenant in just 1 year of service. After all, he was not bright and could not have achieved it. He probably stole those insignia. There was no way he could have become a junior lieutenant. Patrick lowered his eyes when the man asked if Pat wanted him to take it back. At that second, the lieutenant stepped forward and told his father that he was talking too much. He should shut up. He then chopped the man's finger off in one hand motion. The father was shocked and looked at his son in horror. Hearing the screams, the woman wondered what was going on and walked towards the door. She looked outside and turned to the man, who was making pitiful cries. As the woman was strong in body, Patrick wryly wondered if she was about to be led to slaughter. Turning to the lieutenant, the woman was extremely indignant. How dare he say such a thing about her? She would not forgive him. Patrick asked with absolute indifference in his eyes, "What of it? Did she really think he needed the forgiveness of some cheapskate?" The woman fell silent and grinned. She told the lieutenant to leave immediately because if he did that, she would forgive him just like that. Patrick drew his spear from behind his back and put his sword away in a scabbard. Then he asked if she was in her. I wonder if she hit her head, so she doesn't realize that he is for the kingdom and they are for the revolution. The next second, he jumped up and stabbed the spear into his father's back. Blood splattered all around, and the woman looked on in horror at what was happening. Pat wondered if she thought he would let them get away. The father lay on the ground with a spear in his side and was expectorating blood when Patrick said that he was about to be thanked for what they had done for him and asked if the man realized what he was about to do. The man begged his son to wait and not do it, for he could die from such a thing. Pat stood right over him and asked that he did realize the threat of death, but subjecting his own son to it. The father then pleaded for Pat to do it to Marianne. The woman wailed if he was going to betray her, to which she received the reply that she herself had said that black eyes were a sign of a curse. Pat watched in silence, but he couldn't stand it and told them to be quiet. There was cruelty and alienation in his eyes. He told them both to shut their mouths. Then he kicked the father right in the head. The man pleaded, asking Patrick to wait, because if he didn't kill them, they could make a deal. Pat asked why they had joined the revolution. The father, sitting on the ground, replied that the Weston family had promised money for supporting this revolution. Drops of sweat were rolling down his face. Patrick lowered his eyes at him. The next second, the father screamed and blood covered the ground. His face was battered by a boot, and his nose was broken by a heel. Blood was running down his face from his nostrils, and his left eye was so swollen it wouldn't open. Pat stood beside his father's body, with a spear sticking out of it, his clothes soaked with blood, his teeth knocked out. He said the man had held on for a surprisingly long time. There were no fingernails left on the man's fingers, all had been pulled out by the root. The lieutenant turned to his companion, removing the spear from the exhausted body, and said it was her turn. Pat brought the spear in and said he would cut the ropes. The woman smiled. She immediately started to run, but something prevented her. The lieutenant severed a tendon and a bone in her ankle. The woman fell to the ground, her eyes wide with terror. Patrick smirked menacingly and suggested she play her favorite game of sledding, since they played it so often. He started to put the spear away and said that she always knocked it over on the ground and threw large stones in his face. There were screams in the air, and drops of blood rushed in all directions. Pat stood by the practiced woman, who begged for forgiveness, and tossed a pebble he held in his hand. To her pleas, he said that when he spoke like that, she replied that it made no sense for a man to listen to the wishes of any bugs. He smiled and recalled how she had called him a damn child or a worm when he was very young. Memories of his stepmother saying he was the child of a filthy concubine popped into his mind, and she didn't want his father to raise him when he had her, for the poor must always suffer. Then he remembered the image of his mother, holding him crying on her lap. Pat screamed furiously that she had killed his mother. The scarred woman was squirming in pain, lying on the road tiles. Patrick exclaimed that she would die in the same terrible agony. Remembering his mother's face, he looked at the severed heads of his father and stepmother with sword in hand. Pat walked out into the woods to the squad with two heads in his hands, which he held by his hair. He was completely calm while the soldiers were horrified by the sight. Patrick smiled and said that they had a lot of provisions in their carriage and suggested they have a small dinner. He would get everything ready. As they stood inside the carriage, Pat looked around when he heard another one coming and asked the soldiers what to do. Meanwhile, voices were heard outside the carriage. The carriage pulled up. Someone asked if this carriage was Baron Rigsby's property and why it had stopped. Those who arrived decided to get out and see what was the matter and gave the coachman the command to stop. Standing under the door of Baron Rigsby's carriage, a man started knocking and asked those seated inside if they served him and introduced himself as Baron Curly's man, asking what their problem was. Pat flew out the door and in one fell swoop cut the man's head off. Blood gushed and poured all around. The lieutenant exclaimed that he had known Baron Curly was a traitor. The head rolled and stopped between the horse and the carriage. Patrick picked up the bloody sword and said he would have to clean up the mess there. The ground was soaked with blood. The carriage rushed down the road again, wheels pounding on the ground. Pat, looking out the window, said bitterly that in the end he had only managed to kill the Curly family and their men. The soldier sitting opposite looked at him with horror and disgust. The carriage reached the high gate. One of the soldiers said that they reached the fort faster. The kingdom infantry didn't have time to catch up with them. Looking out the window, they realized the gate was closed and wondered how they could get in. The gate rose impressively above the ground. The fortifications here are already much more serious. The fort is built like an imperial fortress, and this time the kingdom will expect an attack from the other side. That is to say, the back gate is heavily fortified, but this is mainly where traders pass through and carry supplies. One of the carts pulled into the gate and a guard approached. Pat thought about climbing into any wagon and trying to sneak in. The guard approached another cart and asked the coachman what they were carrying. The man replied that he was carrying grain, salt, and jerky. The guard decided to inspect the cart. The driver agreed, but there was anxiety in his expression and voice. Inside the cart sat the soldiers, huddled against the boxes and hidden. The guard looked inside silently. He then said that everything was fine and it was okay to pass. The cartman became visibly nervous and the guard asked what was wrong, but the man replied that everything was fine. The soldiers exhaled and continued to sit in the cart. They realized they had snuck into the fort. The cart drove inside. Pat said he was going in search of the warehouse and ordered his comrades to stay and watch the trader so he wouldn't give them away. The soldiers accepted the order. Everything around them was ablaze with hot flames. There were shouts in the fort that the warehouse was burning again. Someone asked if it was treachery. Another hurried the men to put out the fire. The gate was open, with an army of soldiers standing in it. The man in charge reported that Lieutenant General Simon had arrived. Pat looked at them, blood streaming down his face. The general praised Rigsby and said they would take care of the rest, but Patrick objected, saying he would help them. The general agreed and ordered the back gate to be opened and marched to the main entrance. The soldiers opened the massive gate, and the army marched into the fort. A huge crowd of soldiers went through the gate. The general ordered them to advance cautiously. The soldiers' feet gradually tread on the ground. The people inside shouted that more water had to be brought in, and it wasn't enough. They had to do things faster. Others exclaimed where they would get so much water from. They yelled that they needed to keep the fire from spreading and needed to destroy everything that could catch fire. The fire was eating up everything around them. Then the man who was putting out the fire looked back at a strange sound. Right in front of him stood a huge army of archers who had already drawn their bowstring. Rows of soldiers surrounded the crowd on all sides and were ready for battle. The guy who spotted them tried to warn the others and shouted. The people turned around, but it was too late. The soldiers had already started their attack and released their arrows. One of the enemy tried to shout for the others to draw their weapons, but an arrow lodged in his head and interrupted him. Then another continued his words, exclaiming for everyone to forget about the fire and deal with the army. Patrick and the destruction of the kingdom's army. The enemy's soldiers were unarmed. The battlefield turned into a massacre. Blood rushed from everywhere. The attackers fired on the enemy, fighting them with mass attacks, thrusting swords into them. They in turn repelled the attack with whatever they could, some throwing splinters and stones, others stabbing their opponents with pitchforks. Patrick drew his sword confidently. His every movement created a spray of blood. His enemies struck with sticks, but Pat answered them successfully, easily severing their heads with his sword. Blood flooded all around. When an enemy attacked with a knife, Pat reached across their faces, ripping out their teeth with the blow. Patrick stood in the middle of the battlefield with words about how he thought they were almost done. One of the soldiers came up and said that the Imperial army was nowhere to be seen, and it was clear that they had escaped. The flames were still blazing all around. From the layout of the area, it was clear that the kingdom's army was in the upper left corner. Just below them were the warehouse and the command building. To their right was the back gate, and at the very bottom was the main gate. The general said that they came in from the back gate. Those who tried to escape through the main gate would have been captured, so they found another way to escape. If so, it would be through the service gate. Next to the main gate, they could escape while the warehouse was burning. The general reflected, bringing his hand to his face and lowering his eyes, that there must be an imperial prince at the head, and promised to find him. He then ordered the cavalry to scout the vicinity of the fort. The soldiers listened to the order. Pat stood with his thumbs tucked into his pockets and pondered the fact that if Imperial Prince Rudolph ran out of food, he would have to return to his country. He silently raised his eyes in contemplation. The next second, he was already running towards the carriage. The driver saluted him. Pat jumped on his horse and shouted in a hurry that he would scout the woods nearby and leave a front on them. There were boards and sacks of leftover provisions lying on the ground. A group of men rode on horses. His Highness reprimanded and resented the fact that there was no proper food left there. The man riding beside him turned to him and said there was another village ahead, only half a day's ride away. Dust flew across the field from the stomping of hooves, and His Highness shouted that they should move through the forest and look for food along the way. They continued on their way along the trees. The clattering of hooves resounded in the air. His Majesty asked how far they were from the next village, to which he received the answer that there was no normal road, so they had to move slowly and might have to camp for the night. His Majesty cast a glance to the side. There was a rabbit sitting on the grass between two trees. Pat and his aide were moving through the forest and noticed smoke. There were people making a fire on the lawn. Two were fiddling around, setting things up, and the third was lying by the fire, resting. Pat turned to his companion and asked if anyone else of royal blood had fled besides Prince Rudolph. The latter replied that it wasn't, but judging by the clothing, it could be a high-ranking imperial nobleman. Patrick grinned with excitement and thought he would catch him then too. Hopping off his dragon, he said he was off. His companion asked in bewilderment if Pat was going alone. He explained that he was harder to spot alone. The people on the ground were doing their own things. Some were cutting up a rabbit, some were lying down, and some were just drying mushrooms. Patrick crept up to the man with the rabbit in his hands and brought the blade to his neck. In the next second, the lieutenant was already drowning it in the river. At the strange sounds, His Highness woke up and wondered what those sounds were. Then the third man who was drying mushrooms turned his head in surprise. In front of him stood Patrick. With one hand, he held the hilt of his sword, and with the other, he held a dagger that was taking to his master's neck. His Highness raised his hands in fear, trembling and whispering a plea for help. Pat ordered him not to move for one unnecessary movement, and he would kill him. The man raised his hands and agreed that he understood. The rebellion had been crushed. The imperial invasion had been stopped. And the rebellious nobility. There was shouting in the room as someone gave the order to untie the rope, hustled, and exclaimed that he was the next head of the Baron's family. A floor above, a general and a lieutenant stood in the doorway. The general turned to Patrick and asked if they were brothers. He replied that they were, but that the garbage was more useful than they were. The man below exclaimed why on earth they were treating them so, and the other man echoed. The general said that His Majesty had placed their fate in Pat's hands, but he wanted to warn them that the decision would affect their reputations in the future. Patrick averted his eyes and replied that he understood that. Pointing his hand at the people below, he shouted that the eldest son was not only able to stop the rebellion of the head of the family, but also participated in it himself, and ordered him to be dragged through the capital and stoned and then executed. The second son was also stoned and executed after interrogation. That was the end of it. The brothers were outraged at such an order. They looked up and perplexedly turned to Pat. Patrick and the general walked out. There were still cries coming from the floor as to what he was saying. The general said that was the end of it. Pat replied that he would then call it a day. A questioning shriek about whether it was a joke rang through the air. But smiled svetly. His face expressed satisfaction. A few days later, the captured rebellious nobles were executed. The crowd cheered as they looked at the pedestal with the executioners. It was covered in blood spatters all over it. His Majesty's hand rested on the armrest. 5 rebellious families had been crushed, and the ringleader, Rudolph, the third prince of the empire, was ransomed and imprisoned in the empire's prison. A 5-year pact was signed with the empire to ban attacks. The prince sat on his throne and looked wistfully out the window at his domain. A man passing nearby asked if something was troubling him. Peace had returned to the kingdom, or so it seemed. The prince watched in silence and pondered. In the throne room, it was announced that the rewards for achievements in the hard-fought battle against the Saban Empire would soon be announced. The prince announced that Wayne had been promoted to lieutenant, followed by Mirko. Patrick Rigsby is given the new name Viscount Snakes for the destruction of Rigsby House, as well as being promoted to the rank of major and appointed captain of the 8th Rapid Response Regiment. At this point, Pat stood and listened intently, showing no emotion. A little explanation. The regiment is commanded by a major lieutenant colonel. This consists of 3 battalions of 100 men each, which in turn consist of 3 companies that are divided into platoons. The royal family consists of 2 groups, the higher aristocracy, which includes the Duke, Marquis, and Count, and the lower aristocracy, the Viscount and the Baron. Pat was a Baron first, and these titles can be inherited. After the award ceremony, they had a banquet for all the people who have the rank of lieutenant and above. Aisha happily threw herself into Pat's arms. MC in turn remarked that she had grown up. The heads of aristocratic families and top military officials were also invited to the celebration. Manteri's family, Baron Cannon, was also not short of an invitation. The men said hello to Pat, and Dex remarked that the MC looked good. Dex said with a smile that Pat could stop by more often so they could discuss land management. MC thanked him and said that he was now his savior on land ownership issues. They were joined by the Marquis' son Daxon, who welcomed the attendees. The feast passed without incident, after which there was a great change in the army. Wayne left the 8th Regiment. He was transferred to the 2nd Regiment, under the command of Vice Admiral Kimon. The reason for this may have been an engagement to his daughter, whom Wayne met at a banquet. Standing in the woods in front of the soldiers, Pat announced that today was the start of the entertainment camp for the 8th Regiment. He asked if the soldiers would be able to find him in this forest. The soldiers tiredly realized that they had been running all this time not to improve their physical fitness, but to get used to the forest terrain. Pat in turn declared that whoever found him would receive 1 gold. A shout was heard. Seriously? The soldiers were diligently searching for Pat in the forest. One asked if it was even possible to find him. Another with a tired look stated that it was already dawn and they still hadn't found a single trace of him. At this time, MC was lying in a tree and holding an egg in his hand. He was thinking about the fact that no one had found it by morning, and wondered which bird's egg he had been incubating all night. Meanwhile, the soldiers continued their search. One of them mumbled sadly that they had practiced only 1 night and already had so many bruises and abrasions. And the other picked up a worm and suggested to the first that if he ate this, he might cheer up a bit. Pat considered the egg and pondered the fact that in the morning they would practice shooting with a short bow. Their marksmanship was still lame, so they needed to intensify their training. Then later in the afternoon, they would return to the game of hide and seek. He scrutinized the huge egg and wondered why no one had hatched from it yet. Meanwhile, one of the soldiers was talking about how if they didn't find Pat, they could skip dinner. And then he asked the other one what he thought about it. And the other one in turn suggested eating the worm again. MC was still thinking about the egg. He suggested that the shell was too delicate for an island snake egg. In the end, no one ever got the gold coin, and MC caught mice to feed the snake. Back at the barracks, he reasoned that the regiment should first be trained on the importance of identifying any traces of enemies, and sleepless nights should be avoided. At this time, Wayne came up to him from behind. He said hello and mentioned that he had noticed that the 8th Regiment was doing forest training even at night. Pat turned around and replied that there was talk of the Vice Admiral not letting anyone down. Wayne replied with a smile that in any case the 8th Regiment is on a whole other level, and asked if the MC knew what his nickname was amongst the fighters. Pat suggested Major. Wayne replied that his nickname behind his back was God of Death. MC indignantly replied, huh? What? And Wayne explained that his training was a shortcut to the other side of the world. After this conversation, the 8th Regiment was forced to run a hell of a marathon. The soldiers ran for Pat and screamed about how they couldn't take it anymore. And the MC was sentencing with a smile about how it should go without any deaths. Just as a joint exercise between the 2nd Regiment and the desperate 8th Regiment was approved. This news Wayne took with surprise. That day, the 2nd Regiment also began calling Pat the God of Death. Soldiers begged for rest and talked about not wanting to train anymore. Of all the responsibilities heaped upon Pat, there was only one that bothered him. His territory. He had been given a large tract of land, formed when the lands of the former Baron Rigsby and the former Viscount Harder were merged, and MC had absolutely no idea what to do with it. He thought of Cannon and Dex and wondered if they were worth relying on. Pat arrived at Cannon's house and apologized for the disturbance. He was met by Dex and greeted him cheerfully. They went to Uncle Troll's office. On the way, MC asked if Paul the butler was working and asked if he could train with him. He was told that it was fine and Dex had practiced with him yesterday. Walking up to the office, Pat asked permission to enter. Troll greeted him as Patrick and then added, or rather already Viscount Snakes. MC asked to be called by his first name as before. He then stated that he would like to talk about territory management. Troll answered him that House Cannon was not short of fertile arable land, and talked about how they will always have labor. MC spoke of how he wanted to hire the floor's nephew as butler. The maid who served his mother he wants to appoint as headmaid, and asked for a couple of people from the Cannon house grounds. Troll complied with all his requests. Sitting in the carriage, Pat asked Paul if it was normal to speed up like that at his age. MC realized that he was still too slow, so he would have to continue training on his return to the manor. Thus, this would be the first mission of the 8th Regiment. Upon returning to the location, MC established a set of rules. 1. Eliminate the thieves that inhabit the northwestern roads. 2. Periodically patrol the surrounding areas. 3. Report suspicious individuals. He said that all members of the squad must return alive. If even one died, the rest would have their training doubled. The soldiers grimaced and said doubled. Pat related that he had received a report that thieves disguised as a trade caravan were lurking there. One of the soldiers replied that they had already done away with them and asked if these thieves were too weak. Then he asked if these lands belonged to Major General Newgarden. Pat replied that this was true, but that those areas were completely lifeless and there were no people there, so the high land prices were probably to blame. The embarrassed soldier replied strangely that there was no sign of adventurers, and asked if there could be something hiding behind it, and indeed it was hiding. Everyone ran away in panic at the sight of the huge Cyclops. Pat told of how the owner of the domain was too stingy to pay the adventurers for the cleanup, and such a thing could not be hidden forever. So the 2nd Regiment returned in a hurry to report the situation to the capital, and the Newgarden family was apprehended and approved for the cleanup operation. Watching Pat's actions, the soldiers noticed that he was dragging the guts of Cyclopses behind him, because he was the God of Death, or rather the Scarlet God of Death. After that, MC was rewarded again, given the Eagle Award, and promoted to Lieutenant Colonel. His aristocratic title was raised to the rank of Earl, and he was given the remaining pieces of land from Viscount Harder's former holdings. Inside the award was a bracelet, which Pat wore safely. He walked and thought about how it wouldn't come off. Not noticing Sona, he crashed into her, then apologized and asked if she was hurt. Sona replied that she was fine. MC said if everything was fine, he asked to be allowed to bow out. Seeing Pat off with a look, Sona chuckled. She noticed a snake bracelet on his hand, and so the MC was back in the barracks. But now as an earl, since his territory is too far from the capital, he has to live in the barracks. He went into his room and noticed that his pet had changed a lot. The animal that hatched from the egg turned out to be a snake. MC nicknamed it Pie. It looked big enough, but trouble came from when it wasn't expected. There was a shout in the barracks. The soldiers present looked around. The Annie manager ran into the barracks, screaming monster. She was asked what had happened. She said there was a monster in Mr. Patrick's room. Everyone turned in horror towards the MC, and the manageress screamed at him for an hour. She explained to him that because there were a lot of people living in the barracks, it was forbidden to keep pets without permission. But apologized and asked what he should do now. The manageress told him to leave now. So he had lost his home. Pat reassured P that there was nothing wrong with not being allowed in the barracks. He could have slept in the tents of the training center. But the soldiers were intimidated by his pet. That sort of thing just annoyed the MC. So he decided to get his real estate. He went to the Chamber of Commerce to get a property that he could move into immediately after buying it. He was matched with a building and told that it might be too big. Pat replied that it was just right and asked for everything to be formalized. He walked over to his new home. The building looked too huge. It was 2 stories with columns at the entrance and a balcony on the 2nd floor. It was obvious that the building was quite neglected. It was overgrown with plants and covered with cracks. Walking into the house, MC pondered that 100 gold coins was too cheap, but the building wasn't particularly well looked after. At this moment, P was shyly peeking out from behind Pat's back. MC laughed at such a reaction from his pet, and laughingly declared that from now on, this was now their home. And P noticed the rat running away in fear. A maid arrives at Pat's house. She introduces herself as Pamela and tells of being a wolf beast man. She's 30 years old. At her last job with Baron Callie, she hit it off with the gatekeeper, a beast man like her, and they married, or rather planned to, until the Baron's house fell. After that, she lost her job and her lover. She then made the decision to work in one of the mansions in the royal capital, where a large serpent named P had taken up residence. She is grateful that it eats all the rats on the grounds of the mansion. Pat returned to his domain. The maid greeted him, thinking about how huge this snake was. She talked about how, when she first encountered it at the entrance to the mansion, she thought she was going to be eaten and even wet herself a little, but there was nothing she could do about it anymore. She noticed that alcohol had become present in the house, which had not been present under the former Viscount Harder. The whiskey on the table was rice-based. Pamela had heard that this was how the alcohol was made. She knew that they had produced alcohol before, but Pat had invited a wizard to make the whiskey. And instead of rice, it was wild grass that had only been used as cattle feed before. But in any case, everything will be fine if the result will be tasty, Pamela thinks. Next, she moved on to cleaning the Lord's room. She is the only maid, so cleaning such a large mansion takes quite a lot of time. For example, she needs to make sure that the family crest is not hanging crookedly. As expected, the snakes have snakes on their crest. Also, as expected, dealing with this mansion alone is a real pain. Pamela wondered if Pat would hire someone else. That's when the MC came in with the news that he would hire somewhere around 20 more employees. Pamela took the news very happily and remarked that he was just in time. The new employees, upon entering the house, wet themselves with fear at the sight of the snake. Pamela talked about how there were some cool wolf beastmen there too, but it was the first time everyone had such a reaction. But there were some people who weren't scared. A dwarf who was put in charge of the corridors and an elf butler. She had heard they came to them on Dixon's recommendation. Pamela had heard of the Marquis Dixon and had even had a chance to speak with him once. She asked if anyone was interested in what became of the 18 people who did wet themselves, and then said that they don't worry too much about that sort of thing in this house. Besides, the large communal bath is another invention of Mr. Patrick's that he has patented. He also invented a new game called chess. Originally, people were only entertained by card games. She realized that the gentleman was so great that he even created a separate place to train the servants' children, and in that case, she wanted to find a new man for herself in that place. Pat was surprised to ask the elf butler who it was. The man replied that he believed it was a messenger of monsters, and then explained that it is a race of humans who can subdue monsters. They're called tamers. The butler explained that this is possible because of their ability to communicate with monsters using magical powers. MC exclaimed like this, and then looked at his snake bracelet and wondered if they could communicate. A little earlier, Sona ran into her father's office and exclaimed snake, then added that Pat was wearing a snake bracelet. She asked her father if he knew his name. The father answered in the affirmative. He gave his name as Count Patrick von Snakes. Sona exclaimed that Snakes is a snake, and stated that it was a very beautiful name. Her father tried to shout after her that this guy was a snake, and then tried to call her out, asking if she was listening to him. Sona, running away, stated that by knowing his name, she would be able to find out what kind of person he was. She approached the maids, asking who this man was. One of the maids told that he was raising a snake in his mansion. Another said about hearing that he doesn't bother about what he wears. Sona asked with a smile if they had any more information. One maid replied that he preferred low women. Sona exclaimed fine. Then another woman stated that there was no particular love interest next to Pat, so her highness wouldn't have to get her hands dirty. Resolvit, Sona shouted. She stated that he is indifferent to social status and has no favorites. Sona wants Pat to be her fiancé. She ran away. and the maids chatted about how she had changed and even prepared her own clothes. After a while, Mr. Patrick quite suddenly received an invitation to the king's castle. MC came to the castle and sat down in the room opposite Son. Pat introduced himself. Sona introduced herself in response. MC asked why she chose him. After all, he is not an outstanding guy, quite short in stature, and is the third son of the family that joined the recent rebellion, and moreover, he personally killed his parents and brothers in the aftermath. Sona replied that she first met him at the celebration after the rebellion. Although there were many people at the ceremony, he caught her attention. Pat replied that he wouldn't say he was at all unremarkable looking anywhere besides the battlefield, but no one had called him attractive until now. He asked why the princess was the first person. Sona told him that she had deliberately crashed into him then, but he admitted his mistake and apologized first. Pat didn't even know about her being a princess, but still treated her well. And when they held hands, she felt a strong surge of love. The MC thought about her crashing into him on purpose. After all, he was distracted at the time and really had never seen the princess once. He wondered, wasn't this love blind? He got up from his seat and talked about how Her Highness must have heard of him, but he thinks he has a rather creepy character and she still wants to marry him. Sona looked at him with loving eyes and replied that there are a lot of people like him around, but she trusts her intuition. Pat at this moment was thinking that he wished the princess would suddenly hate him and break the engagement. He sat down on his knee and talked about how he hoped she would help him in the future. Sona stood up and cried out that she was a strange princess, but hoped that Pat would not refuse her help either. Soon the matter of marriage was settled. Pat came to the king's domain and told him that a noble family had reported that there had been a manufacturing fraud in the territory and asked if he could gather evidence. The king replied that this information should remain secret, and it was up to Pat to gather the evidence. The aide reported that even the tax collectors would be able to guess what was going on. Therefore, there is no other way left for them. MC replied understandably. He went out for reconnaissance. As he approached the house, he thought about the fact that instead of looking for evidence blindly, he needed to find another way as soon as possible. At this moment, an old lady's voice was issuing from the house, asking the maid if she needed a massage, and then stated that it was hard enough work. After all, her husband is always in that room, and nothing bad will happen if she goes to see him alone. MC noticed the elderly madam and decided to follow her quietly. He noticed that her behavior was quite normal, and speculated that it might be from the fact that she was used to moving around the mansion like that. The old woman knocked on the door and told the gentleman that she was here. The voice behind the door asked Rachel to come in sooner rather than later. Pat tried to analyze all the information he received. He found out about the fact that this old lady has no husband, but she might have one. At that moment, his musings were interrupted by a bracelet. It lit up brightly, and some images from a cloud appeared behind him. MC thought in surprise, "What is that?" It looks like someone's memories from a past life, he assumed. Couldn't he suddenly start seeing ghosts of the past, thought Pat? Or is it an ability from the magic bracelet? He knew about Rachel covering herself with the other half she didn't have by visiting another person, and it's probably all done to cover up something. Pat assumed it was hardly something legitimate. He reported it to the secretary, handing him the paper. He exclaimed that it was classified. He then asked how he had managed to get it. The MC explained that he had taken it out of Rachel's husband's oven. Husband? The secretary was outraged. He hadn't even considered that a woman like that could have someone. Pat let out an exasperated sigh and asked to excuse himself as he was a little tired. Pamela remembers that the gentleman came back tired that day and realized that it was all because of work. She knows that during training in the regiment, he is very energetic. But when he goes to conduct business in the territory, he comes home exhausted. Pamela greeted him with a smile, realizing that their home is the only place where he enjoys life. The butler reported that Princess Sona had just arrived at their mansion to see P. Pat wondered just now, and then asked himself to look at P. He wondered if this was in the norm of things. MC greeted the princess. Sona apologized for the disturbance, with an impressively large number of escorts behind her. The princess exclaimed in surprise at seeing the snake. She smiled and said about it being just as Pat had told her. The serpent is indeed huge. Pat thought about the fact that later he could rest in the bathhouse, and asked Sona if he needed to pre-train P. Sona asked if taking care of his pet was a hobby. He answered correctly and then asked if she likes embroidery. The princess happily exclaimed yes, and then stated that she wanted to try making clothes for him, like a costume. The MC looked at her in surprise, and Sona talked about how it would look like casual wear, but military style or like a tuxedo. She said that she would like to make him a processional vestment. But on fusedli interiethed processional. Sona replied that it would be next April, and she wanted to show off her homemade garment. She revealed that she was thinking of designing for his military uniform, but now she has to prepare something for him for his brother William's wedding. Sona asked not to worry about time, as she will have everything in time and give it to him in a month's time. And then she added that she was quite confident about her speed. Pat replied with a smile that it would help him a lot and thanked her, and then wondered if she was sleeping at all. A month later was the wedding of Prince William and Elizabeth. Pat looked at them and remarked that they were a beautiful couple. They were literally made for each other. And if only every marriage were so well matched. As he passed the people around him, he was approached by various people. One thanked him for the books Pat had lent him and said they were very useful and he would return them soon. MC replied that he could take his time. The other spoke of the long journey Pat had ahead of him and suggested a snack. MC, with a smile, replied with pleasure. At that moment, Sona approached him from behind and said that she was very happy to see him, then added that those clothes looked good on him and wondered who made them, then added that they would see each other later. Pat asked again later and thanked her for the costume. At this point, the king came on stage and thanked the audience, and then announced the engagement of his third daughter, Sonaris. MC thought about what she knew about it. He introduced himself as Count Patrick of the newly formed Snake family, and said he was honored to be engaged to the princess. Sona introduced herself and said that she was happy to be engaged to the man she dreamed of. The people around her were skeptical of this announcement. One wondered about the king at all. Another asked what it was all about. A third spoke of being told that Sona was too young for this. The MC realized that now the new enemies would spring into action. After all, Sona was too young to marry, and her wedding date was set for her 15th birthday, which would be in 2 years. The next day, the servants of the Serpent House were busy preparing for the engagement. The maids were washing, ironing, and arranging the linens. The butlers were busy harvesting the crops. Many festive tables were set up in front of the mansion. Pat exhaled and said that they had somehow managed it. The elf butler tiredly replied yes. The engagement party was organized around tables where the guests could chat, eat, and play chess. It had gone perfectly well. Pat and Sona stood holding hands. The princess looked at her fiancé with embarrassment, and Pat, in turn looking at her, was just beginning to realize that he was really marrying such a lovely girl. At this time in the royal palace, an aide came with the news that the northern tribes had united and attacked again, and then added that their northern army was temporarily holding them back. The aide reported that they had brought 10,000 warriors and the northern army only had 4,000 soldiers. The aides reported that the northern army is in dire need of help, and they plan to send the 3rd and 8th army to help. To which the head of the 3rd army and Pat replied, yes, sir. MC wondered if this invasion was planned after the prince was married. At this time, 4 mysterious figures were having a conversation in a dark room. One of them was realizing that it looked like the kingdom's army was moving. Another was saying that this should drastically reduce the number of troops stationed in the royal capital, and he speculated that they couldn't be in a hurry or things would end badly. And then he added that they would only have one chance to make things right and they should be careful. Pat's regiment arrived in the mountainous region north of the royal capital. He explained to the soldiers that their northern army was opposing the giant rebel army in the northern fortress, and they had been chosen as one of the armies to reinforce them. They're going to sneak up and hit the rebel army from behind, and asked the soldiers to get ready. The battle began. Pat stood in front of one of the enemies holding a dagger in his hand. There was a sound of the blade, and blood rushed in streams from the enemy's neck. The MC reported that their plan had worked. The royal army had completely crushed the rebel attack. He reported that they had finished processing the leaders they had captured after the rebel army began to retreat. The aide clarified if the 8th army had managed to get information from the enemy. Pat revealed that they had admitted that the Empire had encouraged them to attack the kingdom, which was clearly an attempt to go against them. MC wondered if they were using a cheap strategy to gauge their strength, or was this part of a long-term plan? MC asked to report back that the goal of the rebel army was very simple and they couldn't find any insidious intent. They were hungry and they had food, and added that one must allow for inaccurate information after all. The 8th army returned to the royal capital. Pat reported all the information and bowed to the king. He said it was excellent. He then asked to visit Sona while Pat was here. MC suggested that Sona was in a bad mood and maybe missed him, and he was busy wrestling in the north, so he couldn't see her for a while. He walked up to her room, knocked, then came in and said hello. Sona was surprised to see him. She got up from the couch and cheered that he was finally back. She then rushed to run into his arms, saying that she knew he couldn't visit her because he was on duty, but she was still happy to see him. MC apologized for taking so long for him to get back. Sona took him by the shoulder and told him that he didn't need to apologize, and then said about how she had a new military uniform for him and she wanted to see it on him soon and asked him to be her model. Pat looked at her in surprise. Meanwhile, Sona brought the uniform and asked if he was called the Bloody Grim Reaper on the battlefield. then added that that was why she had used a dark crimson colored lining fabric. And on top of that, she had done embroidery in the shape of pea snake everywhere. Sona held out the form to him. Pat realized that he couldn't refuse. He thanked her and said he would wear it now. Sona exclaimed joyfully that she had succeeded in doing so. Pat's mansion erupted with words of "what is this?" The MC had this picture before his eyes. P was holding a human in his mouth, and only his feet were visible. Pat asked the butler if P had caught some strange food, to which the butler replied that an assassin had entered the mansion but was captured. Pat questioned in surprise, "Oh?" P spit the killer out of his mouth. MC walked up to the man and kicked him with his foot, asking the question, "Is he alive?" The killer opened his eyes and saw Pat in front of him, who folded his arms in front of him and said welcome to his snake house. The killer shouted no. As he left, Pat apologized for making the room dirty and asked the butler to clean it up. The butler responded well. MC wondered if the families who didn't like him were starting to organize against him in a united front. He only took 8 families, and so far he's done fine with their schemes, but now he's officially engaged to the princess and is no longer in any family. Pat suggested that they're now making threats against her. The king's aide revealed that while Pat was fighting in the north, assassins had managed to sneak into the mansion. MC replied that they were definitely trained assassins. P looked at Pat with concern, and the assistant picked up the paper and reported what they knew. He revealed that his family's reconnaissance unit had discovered a real threat to Pat, and it seems that some of those people might be after Her Highness Sonaris as well. The aide asked to read the full report. He stated that it was disturbing, and handed the paper to the MC. Pat looked at it carefully and replied about knowing some of the names on the list. For example, Scott Pagano and others. MC realized that there were a lot more details on the list than he had learned from the killer. He learned about the group being made up of noblemen adventurers. Meanwhile, the mysterious customers were talking to each other. One of them was asking where was the assassin they had sent to the snake upstart. He asked when he was supposed to kill a child, and then suggested that perhaps he was still planning his attack. Another asked about whether they should wait any longer, and then added, as for Sung, shouldn't they rather kidnap her and kill her in front of him? The first answered no, and then added that Count Bush wanted her to be his new slave. The other suggested that apparently the Count was planning to have a good time with her. Suddenly a light came into their room. The rebels present were surprised by it. An MC appeared in the room. He said that he found a bunch of rebels. Today's method of punishment he applied was to lose teeth. He wanted to apply an unusual method of torture, and he wasn't doing it for fun. It was just part of his purpose, to protect. The rebel asked the bloody Grim Reaper to continue, for he could not see the desperation in his face. Having finished with them, Pat declared that he wanted to go to the royal capital to destroy the remaining rebels. He hoped that Sona would be safe. In the northern region, there was a well-planned uprising. The number of guards in the royal capital had not been reduced beyond recognition. That was all the 8th Army learned after arriving in the royal capital. While there was no army in the royal capital, an uprising took place. Pat noticed one of the soldiers with a spear and assumed that he was one of the malicious soldiers of the imprisoned nobleman. MC was sure that the nobleman and his men had been arrested before leaving the capital. He wondered how he could freely fight in the uprising. His intuition told him that the second prince, Henry, was somehow involved. Pat addressed the soldiers, saying that the 8th Army must stop the soldiers' rebellion in the capital. He asked them to attack in groups and not to act alone. In the meantime, he was going to find out what was happening in the royal castle. He asked the soldiers not to retreat. MC entered the royal castle and saw that it was in complete chaos. He approached the wounded assistant and asked where the royal family had gone. The assistant replied that he had heard that they had been taken away. With a cry of Sonaris, MC ran in the other direction. He went into her room and was surprised to find that no one was there. He exhaled and caught his breath. MC assumed that Prince Henry must have accomplices in the castle, and perhaps he was holding the royal family somewhere in the castle. He promised himself that Her Highness would be fine wherever she was. Pat wondered how many aristocrats were working with Prince Henry. After all, there are always people who are dissatisfied with the government, and that is natural. But there are many aristocrats who are loyal to the king. And if the second prince hopes to hold on to power, he must use the king as a puppet until he can strengthen his faction, otherwise he will be overthrown. He believed that the crown prince and his wife were valuable hostages and was sure that they were still alive. He thought that Sonaris does not claim the throne, but her death will greatly anger his highness. Pat really hopes that she is still alive. MC entered the king's office and saw that it was destroyed and in complete disarray. He noticed traces of blood on the table and realized that it was fresh and had not yet changed color. He assumed that it had happened recently. After thinking for a moment, he noticed the closet where the king was being held. Pat began to untie the ropes, saying that he would free him immediately. The king stood up and tried to say something about the rebellion. But MC interrupted him with a question about whether Prince Henry had done it. The king asked in surprise how he knew. MC said that he had come across rebellious soldiers on his way to the kingdom and thought they were lying about their leader. Then he asked why Prince Henry would stage a rebellion. But since the castle was destroyed to such an extent, he no longer had any doubts. Pat asked what the captain of the royal guard was doing. The king replied that the captain was in league with Prince Henry. Now Pat understood how they were able to subdue the servants. MC asked what he should do. Then he added that everything concerning the second prince. Before he could finish his thought, he asked if he could eliminate him and his allies. The king remained silent. Pat continued to say that they could no longer remain silent and that this had gone too far. The king said that on behalf of his majesty, he would allow the second prince, Henry, to be killed if Pat could not convince him to surrender. The king said these words with tears in his eyes. It was a difficult decision for him. Pat went out to his army with the announcement of His Highness's order. MC said that they could rid their kingdom of rebellious traitors. The soldiers received this news with skepticism. MC continued to say that the royal guard had turned the castle into chaos and that the rebellious soldiers were walking around as if they owned the place. Then he smiled and said that it was time to hunt. At that moment, sunlight shone through the bars behind which Sona was sleeping. Seeing her brother, she jumped up and asked him why. Henry turned around and replied that she shouldn't worry. He wouldn't let anything happen to her. Sona looked at her brother in confusion. The man guarding her asked Henry if they could have some fun before she was sold. At that moment, with one swift swing of his sword, Henry beheaded the man. He said that it was because of people like this that the kingdom was falling apart, calling him a vulgar man. The man, choking on blood, tried to say something, but his seconds were already up. Henry thought about how the aristocracy was a class of selfish people who pursued their own interests. And the country in which he lived treated commoners as servants and did nothing to help them. He believed that change was necessary. After all, the aristocratic system only knew how to exploit its own people. The government and the armed forces are seen as separate institutions, where the government is called upon to protect the welfare of the people and the armed forces to protect the people. And they're aristocrats, Henry said, clenching his fist tightly. He then added that they should not do anything to the people, but must take responsibility for their actions, and to give up the life they had lived in favor of the people they were called upon to protect. At that moment, Sona was trying to escape from prison, desperately begging for freedom. Henry knows that the nobility and aristocracy are opposed to all this. Therefore, he believed that Sun Heiress must also disappear. Sona listened to this monologue and became despondent. At that moment, she heard an apology for disturbing them. Pat attacked Henry and knocked him to the ground with one blow. Henry let out a painful cry. MC asked if he had broken a couple of ribs. Henry noticed that it was the captain of the 8th Army and said that he had returned home rather quickly. Pat pinned him to the ground with his boot and said that Henry had deliberately tried to lead the army out of the royal capital. He then added that he had heard about his motives. He said there was no need to torture him, as the spies had quickly uncovered the case. Then he added that he had tried to kill Sun Heiress, the girl who was to become his wife, and that was why he would torture him to death. Sona looked fondly at her hero. The MC asked if Henry would beg for mercy, to which he replied no, because he had tried to kill his own family. Then came a blow with the words, right? Pat twisted Henry's arm and said that it didn't matter how beautifully he spoke. He struck Henry's shoulder with his elbow and said that he couldn't just take his family away. Then he hit him in the face, saying that Henry couldn't even protect his own family. Another blow, with the words that it wasn't just his family, but his entire country. At that moment, the king appeared, calling out to MC. Pat asked why he was crying. After all, it was his decision. The king burst into tears, crying out in anguish. He said that Henry should be buried in secret and asked that it be kept confidential. The king asked Henry to become William's assistant. Henry replied, "Yes, father." Henry tried to say that he had looked around the city. He wondered if this was freedom for the people. Wasn't this a system in which only the aristocracy could prosper? He wondered what he could do about it. The king replied that there were things only Henry could do. He hugged his son. Meanwhile, Pat freed Sona. She joyfully shouted his name. Then she said that it was very cool. MC replied in astonishment that yes, it was. Sona noticed that Pat had finally called her Sun Heiress, and she was very happy about that. She hugged him, saying, "Grim Reaper." Since the day of Prince Henry's rebellion in the royal capital, no one had seen him again. People seemed to have forgotten about it, and months passed as they worked on rebuilding. Pat and Sona got married. History was rewritten, and the past would soon be forgotten. The end. Thanks for watching. Write your feedback in the comments. If you like the story, please like and subscribe. See you soon.